was a tender ship. That's a smaller ship that usually stayed with larger warships to handle tasks that the larger ship could not, like bringing men to shore in a shallow area. One source I read said this particular ship only had a few swivel guns. Another, which I tend to believe more, said it had at least 4 small cannon as well. Either way, it was intimidating enough for most merchant vessels, but not much more than that. As part of the mission, Admiral Graves tasked the Margaretta's commander, Henry Moore, to recover some cannon from a small ship that had sunk in the area a few months earlier. The HMS Halifax had gone down in February after hitting some rocks. Some say a local pilot deliberately sank the ship. Other accounts hold that the pilot was simply incompetent. Since the pilot fled the ship and disappeared, no one ever discovered his true motivation. The Halifax went down with several cannon, and Admiral Graves was concerned that the Patriots might recover the cannon for use against the British military. On June 2nd, the convoy arrived in Machias. It took several days before Jones could call a town meeting to get approval to trade with the British Army in Boston. As I said, though the town generally supported the Patriot cause, it had been hard hit by a drought and the closing of Boston Harbor. With the outbreak of war, few traders were even stopping there, and without this trade, they might starve over the winter. A good negotiator might have been able to convince the crowd to go along with the trade. Jones, however, was not such a good negotiator. He was afraid that the Patriots would attack him or his property for trading with the army. He insisted that the townspeople sign a document approving of his actions in trading with the regulars and agreeing to protect him and his property against anyone who might take action against him for these trades. Jones also called on Moore to move the Margaretta up the river closer to town so that the British ship's guns could intimidate anyone who decided to take action against Jones or his ships. On June 6th, the town held a meeting at Burnham's Tavern to discuss the matter. The town was divided. Faced with the very real possibility that the Margaretta might level their town, or that they might starve for lack of supplies, a majority of the town voted in favor of Jones. With that, Jones docked his ships and offloaded supplies. However, Jones would only provide food to those who voted in his favor. Those who voted against got nothing. So the hardcore patriots in town who had voted against Jones decided they really had nothing to lose. Without food, their families would starve. They had no good reason not to take action against these collaborators. Benjamin Foster was a lieutenant of militia and a sometime business partner of Jones. He and another prominent patriot, Jeremiah O'Brien, organized a group of patriot militiamen with the goal of capturing the ships and taking the British fleet prisoner. Without any arms to use against the cannons, they needed the element of surprise. On June 11th was a Sunday. Both Jones and Moore attended church services in town. The Patriots intended to capture the men on land and then demand the surrender of their ships. About 30 Patriots formed a militia party to capture the men. They were not, however, able to execute the plan as intended. Those in the church saw the men advancing and had time to escape. Moore and his first mate escaped out of a window and returned to their ship. Jones fled into the woods and hid. Once back aboard his ship, Moore threatened to destroy the town unless they returned Jones. Unimpressed, the Patriots swarmed onto one of Jones's ships, most think it was the Pollard, and plundered it of anything of value. They demanded that Moore strike his colors and surrender. His refusal led to a brief firefight with small arms. As night fell, the British captain decided that the situation was getting out of control, so he weighed anchor and began to float downstream. The Patriots meanwhile stormed Jones's other ship, the Unity, and decided to pursue the Margaretta. Some locals pursued the ships in smaller boats and canoes as well. The two ships began a running firefight in the dark, and the Margaretta was not fast enough to escape and had to stop several times to effect repairs. The British found another ship about a half-mile downriver that was loaded with lumber. The crew boarded the ship and put part of the cargo on the Margaretta's deck to build defenses for an expected fight. At first light the following morning, Moore abandoned Jones and tried to make his escape. The Margaretta cast off and sailed for open sea. Now the Patriot commander, Jeremiah O'Brien, took command of the Unity with a crew of about 40 volunteers and was sailing after the Margaretta. The pursuers were armed only with muskets and swords. The other colonial leader, Benjamin Foster, also decided to enter the fray. Another small merchant vessel, the Falmouth packet, had docked at Machias a day or two earlier. Foster commandeered the ship and took another 20 Patriot volunteers aboard to pursue the British. The Margaretta had a few miles head start and probably could have escaped, but the ship accidentally turned into the wind, causing the sails to swing wildly across the deck and slam into another part of the ship, thus damaging the sails and crippling the Margaretta. Now luckily for the crew, they spotted another small merchant ship. Moore sent over a boarding crew to take the ship alongside his damaged one. The crew removed the boom and the gaff from the ship to replace their damaged parts. Just as they were finishing repairs, the Unity and the Falmouth packet came into sight. Once again, the ships exchanged fire in a running firefight. The Patriots called on Moore to surrender, but he refused. The slower-moving Margaretta was better armed with swivel guns and grenades, but the Patriot ships were faster and had more men. Eventually, the Unity ran into the Margaretta's starboard, while the Falmouth packet pulled alongside the ship's port side. The crew of both ships jumped aboard the Margaretta and began hand-to-hand combat. The fighting finally ended when Moore took 2 bullets to the chest and stomach. His first mate, also shot, but not as seriously, ran below deck and hid. The crew finally surrendered, and all 3 ships were turned to Machias. There, Captain Moore succumbed to his wounds the following day. As far as casualty ranks, I've seen several different reports, and they all seem to contradict each other. The highest I've seen say the British lost 5 killed and 9 wounded. The Patriots suffered probably 10 killed and 3 wounded. The Patriots, however, captured the ships and used the guns of the Margaretta to arm the colony and renamed it the Machias Liberty under the command of O'Brien. They would use it to capture 2 more Navy schooners later that summer. The Patriots took Jones prisoner, confiscated all of his property, and sent him with the surviving crew of the Margaretta down to the Provincial Congress as prisoners of war. Now, the fact that the colonists were able to capture a British naval vessel was a big deal. As I said, the British Navy had its successes and generally controlled the waters. I mentioned earlier the capture of the Champion, that was a merchant vessel from Maryland bringing food supplies to the Provincial Army. Its capture brought barrels of flour and corn to the Boston garrison. Although it did not get Jones's promised shiploads of wood from Machias, the Navy did capture other merchant vessels loaded with wood that they took back to Boston. The Navy realized, however, that their smaller schooners out alone might find themselves outmatched and captured by the angry locals, as was the Margaretta. Collecting supplies, let alone enforcing maritime laws, would not be a simple task with a people at war with them. Now, years later, James Fenimore Cooper referred to the battle at Machias as the Lexington of the Seas, being the first real naval battle of the war. Calling it the first day, of course, ignores Arnold's earlier capture of British ships in Lake Champlain, as well as the Battle of Buzzards Bay that we discussed at the beginning of this episode, both of which happened earlier. Machias, however, was a full ship-to-ship battle, which Arnold's raid really was not. And it also resulted in the capture of a Navy ship, not just prize ships like those at Buzzards Bay. But even after Machias, the colonists still were really in no position to challenge the British Navy. At best, the Provincials might capture the occasional merchant vessel or an isolated small tender ship like the Margaretta. They were an inconvenience to the Navy, but not a real challenge. It would be some time before the Americans would have a proper Navy. and they would mostly have to await the arrival of the French fleet to pose much of any challenge at sea. Next week, we're going to head south to view the Second Continental Congress again, where they decide quickly that a full-scale war is going to require the establishment of a continental army. Hi there, back again for another American Revolution podcast, book recommendation. But before I get to that, I wanted to mention that a couple of weeks ago, I recorded an interview with Podcasting Smarter, a podcast that interviews podcasters. Since I'm recording this episode in advance of the interview, I don't know how it went yet, but by the time you hear this, it should be out and available for listening. If it is, I will add a link to my website, www.amrevpodcast.com. Generally, I try to make this podcast about the topic of the American Revolution, not about me. But if you are interested in why I do this or how I got started, you can listen to this interview. My podcast also made Podbean's featured list recently. If you just joined the revolution after seeing us listed there, welcome aboard. Okay, on to this week's book selection. Now, normally I select a book that deals with the topic of this week's episode. It's usually one that goes a little deeper or carries the story a little further than I can in one short episode. This week, my book recommendation is something completely different. The book I want to talk about is Valley Forge by Bob Drury and Tom Clavin. Valley Forge, of course, is where the Continental Army camped during the difficult winter of 1777 to 78, while the British occupied Philadelphia. I probably won't get into this in the podcast for a couple more years. So why am I recommending this book now? Well, the timing this week is not about the subject of the podcast, but that the book is just about to be released. That's right, this is a brand new book. The publisher was kind enough to send me an advance copy, and I loved it. There are a few books about Valley Forge already published, but this one is very good. It covers the period when the British take Philadelphia in 1777 until they abandon it about a year later. Valley Forge is an absolutely critical time for the Continental Army. We remember it primarily as a rather desperate winter at a time when the soldiers finally got some professional training. The authors, Drury and Clavin, have collaborated on a few other books involving various events in U.S. history. They have a background in journalism as well. The book itself is about 350 pages, with another 50 pages or so of notes and indices, although the final version may be a little different. I found it to be well written and that it provides a good understanding of that period of the war. If you have already read books on the topic, this book does not really disclose anything new. It's certainly better than the fictional account that Newt Gingrich produced a few years ago. And I don't mean to pick on Mr. Gingrich. I really just prefer interesting nonfiction to a book that blends fact and fiction in a way that you cannot really separate them. Drury and Clavin's book sticks to the facts, but it does it in an interesting and compelling way. The publisher releases the new book on October 4th. You can pre-order it today on Amazon.com so that you get it on week 1. Remember, if you order through the link on my website, www.amrevpodcast.com, Amazon gives me a commission that helps support this podcast. Well, that's it for this week. I hope you will join me next week for another American Revolution podcast. Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. Today, episode 64, the Second Continental Congress begins. On the morning of May 10, 1775, just hours after Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen stormed Fort Ticonderoga, and 3 weeks into the siege of Boston, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. Our First Continental Congress, which I looked at back in episode 48, had set this date to meet when it disbanded at the end of October 1774. At that time, his purpose was to decide what steps to take if the king and parliament refused to take acceptable action on their petitions. Well, not only had London refused to consider the petitions, but now war had broken out, and Congress had to play catch-up with what was now a shooting war. Many of the representatives were returning from the first Congress. There were some new faces, though, who would have major roles. John Hancock had joined the Massachusetts delegation. Benjamin Franklin returned from London and sat with the Pennsylvania delegation. Thomas Jefferson joined from Virginia, replacing Peyton Randolph a few weeks into the session. Georgia, you may recall, had not sent a delegation at all to the first Congress. This time, one Georgia parish sent a single delegate, Lyman Hall. A full delegation would arrive a few months later. The second Congress was more willing than the first to take radical action. Part of that was the fact that prominent Tories who had gone to the first Congress now decided that further participation could be seen as treason. Part of it also was that many moderates had seen intervening events and recognized that the outbreak of war required a new response. The Second Continental Congress essentially broke down into three factions. The most conservative faction, led by men like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, still wanted to return to the relationship that the colonies had with Parliament at the end of the French and Indian War. Parliament held authority over the empire, but essentially respected the rights of the colonies to govern and tax themselves. Even these most conservative delegates would be considered radicals by Parliament's standard back in London. Most delegates probably fell into a middle moderate category. They believed Parliament could not be trusted to govern the colonies. They still hoped to fashion a compromise with London that would allow the colonial legislatures to govern and tax themselves, but still operate as loyal subjects to the king. They essentially wanted a new power-sharing arrangement that would keep them within the protection of the empire, but otherwise operate independently. Most of the southern delegates fell into this category, as well as delegates from other regions. Finally, the most radical faction accepted the idea that with war having come, there really was no option other than full independence. John Adams and a few other New Englanders had probably reached this conclusion by this time, but they dared not express it openly in Congress yet. They realized they needed moderates to bring the other colonies into the fight. They could not afford to scare them away. As events progressed, they hoped that others would accept that nothing would work but independence. Peyton Randolph of Virginia, who had presided over the First Continental Congress, received unanimous re-election to the second. Randolph, a lawyer from one of the wealthiest and most prominent families in Virginia, was a well-respected moderate. Within weeks, though, he had to return home. Congress then elected John Hancock of Massachusetts to preside over the Congress. The first few weeks of the Congress were a scene of chaos and confusion for the delegates, as they received depositions from Lexington and Concord. The siege of Boston, involving tens of thousands of armed militia, was only one issue. Congress soon began to receive reports about the capture of Fort Ticonderoga. All over the continent, colonists rose up, forming armies, confiscating arms and ammunition for public armories. They forced royal governors and even outspoken Tories to flee for their lives. A small contingent of British regulars in New York were stuck on Navy ships in the harbor. The soldiers dared not set foot on land. Royal governors up and down the continent found their positions completely untenable. Absent the arrival of British regulars, each governor realized his options were becoming limited to being asked to leave, being taken prisoner, or joining the Patriot cause. No governor with a royal appointment took that third option, not even Governor William Franklin of New Jersey, who split permanently with his father Benjamin, now in the Continental Congress. Only elected governor of Connecticut, Jonathan Trumbull, transitioned to the Patriot leadership. So with all this going on, one of Congress's first decisions was whether their goals had changed. Were they seeking independence? Were they supporting an armed rebellion? Or were they simply trying to get the king and parliament to move back to the status quo? John Dickinson gave a lengthy speech urging Congress not to go too far too fast. His views had really not changed much since he wrote the Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer years earlier to stir up opposition to the Townshend Acts. Dickinson thought they had three options. One was to stop talking to London and simply fight the war. Dickinson raised fears of British incited slave revolts in the South, using the French and Indians against New England, and devastation by the regular Army and Navy as making this option far too dangerous. His next option was to continue military opposition while petitioning the King of Parliament once again. Although previous petitions had fallen on deaf ears, now that Lexington and Concord had shown the colonists could fight, perhaps London would be more amenable to petitions. The third option would be to send negotiators to London to work out a solution in person. And to Dickinson, this seemed like the best option. Dickinson's position, requesting that Parliament simply restore the status quo, put him squarely within the mainstream patriot thought 5 years earlier. Others, though, had moved on. Most delegates realized they could never trust Parliament to support their best interests. They wanted complete autonomy over domestic affairs with only shared loyalty to the king. And a few, as I said, did not even want that, but they were keeping quiet, at least for now. Several delegates spoke in opposition to Dickinson, including Patrick Henry. And even that outspoken Virginia radical did not propose independence. Samuel and John Adams both opposed Dickinson's ideas in letters written afterwards, but they did not want to appear too radical to the rest of Congress in the debates quite yet. The Massachusetts delegation still feared that the rest of the colonies would say, "You guys are nuts," and leaving them to fight the war on their own. So the Dickinson debates resulted in 4 votes, the first 3 nearly unanimous, referring to themselves as His Majesty's most faithful subjects, which had been put in a precarious situation that unfortunately resulted in the battles of Lexington and Concord, and that all the colonies would work toward defending their fellow citizens in Massachusetts, and that they hoped for a restoration of harmony between the colonies and the mother country, though they stayed away from any specifics about what that harmony might entail. The 4th vote passed narrowly, and that was to submit another petition to the king calling for negotiations to work out an acceptable power-sharing plan. The fact that the last vote was so narrow says that most delegates had accepted that the time for talk was really over. Based on the next few weeks, it seems clear that even many of those that supported another petition did not see much coming from it. They would prepare for war, but if you want to send another document to the king, knock yourself out. The final votes on the debate took place on May 26th, just one day after the HMS Cerberus landed in Boston, bringing the military reinforcements from London. As Congress debated its new petition to the king, word reached Congress about Allen and Arnold capturing Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point. Now, unlike Lexington and Concord, which could be portrayed as self-defense against British aggression, capture of these forts clearly constituted an aggressive act of war. For the moderates and conservatives still looking for negotiated peace, this was a nightmare. Although Allen claimed his capture in the name of the Continental Congress, no one in Philadelphia heard of the attack before it was over. It is almost certain that Congress never would have approved it ahead of time. Not only did it create a divide between the war factions and the negotiation factions in Congress, it started a big colonial dispute as well. New York was probably the most pro-royalist colony attending the convention. The fact that extra-legal committees in Massachusetts and Connecticut approved an invasion into New York without notice or consent did not sit well with many New Yorkers. The fact that Ethan Allen was involved only made things worse. Many New York delegates considered the man a terrorist. To keep New York happy and prevent any further conflict, Massachusetts agreed to turn over the fort to New York, but asked that the cannon be shipped to Boston for use in the siege. There is actually very little in the congressional records about Ticonderoga, and apparently most of the discussions were done in committee and without much written record. What we do know, though, shows Congress simply was not ready to start managing a war even before it decided to create an army. But when the Dickinson debates were over, Congress in early June finally turned to the matter of creating an army. It was clear that the Massachusetts Provincial Congress was in over its head. The Massachusetts delegation had been pushing all along to get the other colonies more involved in the fighting. When Benjamin Church arrived with news from Boston and Joseph Warren's request that Congress take control of its army, Congress got down to business. After a few days of debate, Congress agreed to support a 10,000-man army in Massachusetts and a 5,000-man army in New York. The army in Massachusetts already far exceeded 10,000 men, so I guess not all of them would be able to go on the Continental payroll. Many of those besieging Boston were happy to stay in their militia and not join this new Continental Army. The New York Army would need to incorporate New York militia, which had not flocked to Boston in significant numbers. But with the capture of Crown Point and Ticonderoga, New York would likely have to defend against the British invasion from Canada. Congress also made an effort to ensure some of the middle colonies at least got involved in the conflict. It called for 6 companies of riflemen to be raised in Pennsylvania, still one of the most reluctant colonies to commit to the cause. Maryland and Virginia would also raise 2 companies of riflemen each. To pay for all of this, Congress authorized raising $2 million Spanish dollars. Now this act alone probably needs explanation on multiple levels. First, why are we using Spanish dollars instead of pounds? The Spanish silver dollar had become common currency throughout the Americas. Spanish colonial gold and silver mines had sent their product to mints also in Latin America, meaning lots of this hard money circulated all over the Western Hemisphere. A shortage of British hard currency in America caused colonists to turn to Spanish dollars. About 4 Spanish dollars was worth about 1 British pound. Spanish dollars were often broken up into eighths. They literally broke the coin into pieces. And this is where we get the term pieces of 8 that you sometimes hear used in pirate movies. The pieces were also called bits, which is why today we still call a quarter of a dollar 2 bits. Calculating the authorization in Spanish dollars meant that no single colonial currency would be involved, and that the authorization would likely hold its value, unlike colonial currencies, which often sank with inflation. So where did Congress get the authority to do this? The Continental Congress really was just a meeting of colonial delegates to discuss foreign policy. It had no authority to raise taxes or spend large sums of money. The Congress decided to simply act on its own. It called on each of the colonies to pony up the necessary funds. Now, success in collecting that money was mixed at best and would prove an ongoing problem for the next decade or so. But for now, Congress would issue paper notes, essentially IOUs, promising to pay the bearer in Spanish hard currency at some point when they could get their hands on it. For now, we cannot worry about money. We've got a war to fight. And, maybe we'll all be dead before the bills come due anyway. So having approved the creation of an army, Congress next had to select someone to lead it. Doing this was no easy task. First, there were no experienced generals in America, unless you count militia generals, many of whom may never even seen combat, or those guys in Massachusetts that the Provincial Congress made generals a few weeks earlier. This new leader would have to create a whole new army and put it into battle against British regulars almost immediately. The military ability was only one consideration. Another was loyalty to Congress. Next to defeat, the greatest fear of many delegates was that they would create a successful general who would become the next Oliver Cromwell, the Puritan general who overthrew King Charles I and then Parliament a century earlier. Armies had a way of turning into dictatorships. Any military leader could not have anything even hinting at such an inclination. Another consideration was diversity. Political leaders wanted to make sure the new commanders would represent many different colonies. If all the colonies were going to participate in the fighting, they simply could not be seen as joining a Massachusetts army. A continental army had to be truly continental, with leaders from the north, south, and middle. Congress considered a number of people, and although this debate did not make it into the records, we know from letters and other recollections what delegates were debating among themselves, probably mostly in evening discussions at taverns over a few beers. One of the top military leaders allied with the Patriot cause was Charles Lee of Virginia. He had served as a lieutenant colonel in the British Army. He had seen combat in America and Europe during the 7 Years' War. He had served in Polish and Portuguese armies to get more battlefield experience when Britain was at peace, but unable to secure a full colonelcy, he retired from the Army and moved to Virginia in 1773. Now he was in Philadelphia offering his services to Congress. Despite his battlefield experience, Lee was a professional soldier and a bit of a mercenary, having served in several foreign armies. Congress was not quite ready to hand over command to someone who might not be completely dedicated to the political cause. Another consideration was Artemus Ward, the current commander-in-chief of the Massachusetts Provincial Army, since he was already essentially doing the job. But Ward was old and had already proven sickly on several occasions. Besides, Congress really wanted to look outside of Massachusetts. Not even the Massachusetts delegation was pushing for Ward. John Hancock also got some consideration. He had been titular commander of the Massachusetts militia at one point, but he really had not commanded men in combat. Besides, he seems to have taken the political route, becoming the president of Congress. He was also from Massachusetts at a time when everyone seemed to be looking for someone from another colony. Horatio Gates also got serious attention. Like Lee, he had served for many years in the British Army, rising to the rank of major, and eventually retired in Virginia. Gates was old enough to have fought in the War of Austrian Succession. He followed General Braddock to America at the beginning of the 7 Years' War, marching alongside fellow officers Thomas Gage, Charles Lee, and a militia officer named George Washington at the Battle of the Monongahela in 1755. Gage served throughout the war and as a peacetime officer through the 1760s. Eventually, however, he realized he did not have the money or influence to further promotions and retired to a farm in Virginia. Again, Congress liked his experience, but was not sure about his dedication to the cause and Congress to make him overall commander. Finally, there was George Washington, the delegate from Virginia, in a classic case of dressing for the job you want, not the job you have, began attending congressional sessions in his Virginia militia uniform. Although Washington had experience in the French and Indian War, he had done little to distinguish himself during the war. He lost most of the battles in which he fought and never had a commanding role once the regulars arrived. He had tried to get a commission in the regular army, but failed in that result. He had been commander of the Virginia militia, but had primarily been a ceremonial leader for the past decade, pursuing instead the